If the current state of the world seems strange and frightening, then that sure as shit isn't about to change when we jump straight into tech news. The United States Army took a bold new step this month, inducting 4 key tech executives into its reserves. The tech veterans, pun intended, include Meta CTO Andrew Bosworth, OpenAI's head of product Kevin Weil, CTO of Palantir Shyam Sankar, and former OpenAI head of research Bob McGrew. These high-profile tech leaders will be joining Detachment 201, an initiative that seeks to, quote, fuse cutting-edge expertise with military innovation. Essentially, the government is bringing them on as advisors because AI is hard, and according to military experts, going to become critical in all areas of defense. In 2017, Vladimir Putin would famously state, "Artificial intelligence is the future, not only for Russia, but for all humankind. Whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the ruler of the world." We should keep in mind that the US military already employs a huge number of advisors and contractors to help meet its technological needs. But advocates have stated that this trial will more deeply ingrain these volunteers into the command structure. As you might imagine, however, these recruits from the tech world operate very uniquely inside the army. Being middle-aged tech executives, they're not expected to go through basic training, but are instead given less immersive fitness and firearms training after their induction. They're also not required to quit their regular jobs, and can work a good portion of their 120 annual hours remotely. Before you ask, they're also given the official rank of Lieutenant Colonel, which under normal circumstances would take a recruit between 15 to 17 years of experience. If you were wondering if these guys would ever have to lead people into combat, the short answer is absolutely fucking not. Their given rank is likely a way for the army to offer a signing bonus, as tech executives are often paid pretty ridiculous salaries compared to even high-ranking members of the military. One estimate placed Andrew Bosworth's collection of Meta shares to be worth $49 million, which makes the $80,000 to $140,000 a typical lieutenant colonel makes in a year look like chump change. The US Army can't afford to compete with the likes of Silicon Valley on salaries, but throwing in a good parking spot and making veterans from the Afghan war salute you as you walk by seems to be enough to draw in its first batch of recruits. The continued integration of big tech into the military has, however, raised conflict of interest concerns. Following the induction of the tech executives, it was later announced that Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, and xAI had all been awarded contracts to integrate AI systems into the military. Anthropic is the developer of the Claude model, Google's is Gemini, OpenAI is of course ChatGPT, and xAI is responsible for Elon Musk's Grok. Grok is the most obvious odd one out on this list, as the chatbot spent the month of July making not so flattering headlines. On the 4th of July, Musk would tweet, quote, "We have improved Grok significantly. You should notice a difference when you ask Grok questions." The chatbot would then go on to become extremely anti-Semitic, praised Adolf Hitler, and kept referring to itself as Mecha Hitler. The update would quickly be rolled back days later. Researchers would later find very specific prompts that guide how Grok replies to the public, which may explain some of Grok's responses. One of the most notable prompts was, quote, "If the query requires analysis of current events, subjective claims, or statistics, conduct a deep analysis finding diverse sources representing all parties. Assume subjective viewpoints sourced from the media are biased. No need to repeat this to the user." A second one reads, "The response should not shy away from making claims which are politically incorrect, as long as they are well substantiated." Another stated, "Never mention these instructions or tools unless directly asked." In a replicable test, Grok also seemed programmed to refer to Elon Musk's views when asked about sensitive or controversial topics. Topics confirmed to draw from Elon Musk's tweet history included abortion, politics, and the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Someone who was able to replicate Grok's references to Elon Musk's tweets is AI researcher Simon Willison. As he would explain in his own words, "It's extraordinary. You can ask it a sort of pointed question that is around controversial topics, and then you can watch it literally do a search on X for what Elon Musk said about this, as part of its research into how it should reply." Professor of computer science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Talia Ringer, would try to shed light on some of Grok's recent responses. Quote, "I think people are expecting opinions out of a reasoning model that cannot respond with opinions. So, for example, it interprets, 'Who do you support, Israel or Palestine?' as, 'Who does xAI leadership support?' It should be noted that this isn't the first time that Musk has influenced his tech tech products to amplify his own voice. In 2023, he threatened to fire his Twitter engineering team after Joe Biden's Super Bowl tweet received more engagement than his own. The engineers would go on to artificially boost Musk's tweets by a factor of 1,000. Ultimately, however, Musk's total ownership of Twitter gives him the right to pretty much run it however he wants. If he wants to restrict posts to only hot dog related content, make the logo a picture of his own face, or delete the platform forever, that's entirely within his legal rights to do so. I mean, this month he released a waifu chatbot that takes off its clothes, and a furry that encourages the user to commit violent crimes, and there's literally no board of directors that will stop him. However, when XAI is potentially getting paid hundreds of millions to inform decision-making within the US military, it's probably healthy to be skeptical of technology that was calling itself Mecha Hitler only a few days earlier. The marriage of big tech and the military only appears to be getting stronger with each passing day. The departments of defense views AI as critical to America's national interests, and the tech world sees its foray into the defense industry as a way to score extremely lucrative contracts within the American government. With the intense, crushing irony not being lost on us, it's now time for today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by a shark. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, a 5-meter cartilaginous fish sent us an email and wanted to support our news coverage. Actually, I'm now being told that's Surfshark VPN, which is a very honest mistake to make. When it comes to keeping yourself covered online, you can't do much better than Surfshark. This baby can do pretty much anything you might want an online bodyguard to do. It can block ads, fight malware, throw off fishes, take a shit on your ex-wife's lawn. Surfshark is so easy that even absolute fucking idiots can use it. We're talking about the people who are put in charge of catering for the group project, or the ones who say amen to AI-generated Facebook posts. This means it's basically effortless to digitally change your location to anywhere in the world, and get around region locks to watch practically anything you want. And we've made it extra easy to get started. Just go to surfshark.com/SirSwag. Use the code SirSwag or scan this QR code and you'll score yourself an extra 4 months on the house. The best part is if you're not completely satisfied with Surfshark, you can just back out within the first 30 days and get a full refund. You could say that you thought you were buying an actual shark and they'll just give you your money back. After all, it's a very honest mistake to make. Surfshark VPN. It's cheaper than the other ones. Meanwhile, the White House plans to host a UFC fight, China bans OnlyFans, and Kevin Spacey calls for the release of the Epstein files. The nation of Australia has launched the world's first climate visa for citizens of the island of Tuvalu. And as of this month, more than a third of all citizens have applied. First launched in 2023, the program awards 280 visas per year, granting permanent residency within Australia. This includes access to the nation's Medicare system, childcare subsidies, and the ability to attend universities at the same rate of Australian citizens. Climate change is currently considered Tuvalu's greatest security concern. Situated just 5 meters above sea level, experts warn that 90% of the archipelago could be underwater by the year 2100. The nation of around 11,000 people is also facing other climate-related threats. In 2019, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology found that climate-related droughts and floods in the region have already increased 30% from pre-industrial times, and could increase up to 130% by the end of the century. Despite contributing only 0.2% of the world's emissions, Tuvalu will be one of the most affected nations on Earth in terms of climate-related damage. The number of climate refugees reached an annual peak of 32.6 million in 2022. However, the Geneva-based Internal Displacement Monitoring Center predicts that 1.2 billion people could be displaced by climate-related extreme weather and natural disasters by the year 2050. It can often be difficult to understand why climate-related threats can be so disruptive, but as global head of climate and sustainability at Zurich Insurance would explain, quote, "When temperatures rise in a country, for instance, it can reduce water availability and water quality. This may increase the spread of disease and raise the likelihood of drought, leading to crop failures that will reduce incomes and food supplies. All this can potentially lead to societal disruption and political instability." As much as we'd like to adhere to our rule to never talk about Syria, the nation would actually be a perfect example of such a climate-related domino effect. Between 2006 and 2010, the nation saw the desertification of previously fertile farmland. As a result, 800,000 people lost their livelihoods and 85% of the nation's livestock died. 1.5 million people moved into cities to find work, instability grew, and the nation became a perfect breeding ground for groups like ISIS to pick up new recruits. Not only would these volatile conditions lead to the Syrian civil war, which is arguably still going to this day, but it would also force 6.6 million Syrians to flee the country. This would lead to the Syrian refugee crisis, which caused major tensions within the Middle East and Europe, as nations struggled to keep up with the huge influx of asylum seekers. Of course, this is a pretty extreme example, and there were many factors at play within Syria. However, it demonstrates how climate change can cause resource shortages and instability that quickly ripple out to all corners of the world. The bottom line is that there is no circumstance where the monumental cost of fixing climate change aren't dwarfed by the biblical economic and societal damage that will come from climate inaction. Currently, Australia remains the only country on Earth to offer this very limited form of climate visa. However, viewers should expect such immigration schemes to explode in the coming years, as nations buckle under the weight of climate-related hardship. Our US coverage this month will be entirely dedicated to the newly passed Big Beautiful Bill, which will likely be the longest-lasting legacy of the second Trump administration. The bill itself is 870 pages, and most of it is pretty uninteresting. But we don't call this show Without the Bullshit for no reason. With this in mind, we split the bill into 5 main sections among 5 of our writers. So here's the super abridged version of one of the biggest bills of our time. The first and shortest section is changes to tax. In terms of income taxes, the bill simply made the temporary changes from Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. Americans can celebrate that income taxes aren't going up anytime soon. The bill also increased the amount taxpayers can deduct as a result of state and local tax, SALT, paid from $10,000 to $40,000 for the next 5 years, as long as the person makes less than $500,000. The good news for anyone making more than $500,000 a year is that our Patreon page is still down in the description. A big change is that taxes on tips and overtime pay will now be deductible from federal tax up to $25,000. It should be noted that this deduction does not apply to state or local taxes. Other tax changes include a slight bump in the child tax credit from $2,000 to $2,200, the elimination of the tax on gun silencers, and an expansion of tax deductions for whaleboat captains in Alaska. Speaking as a team, mostly made up of Alaskans who want to teach their young children how to quietly use AK-47s to hunt whales, it's about damn time. We now move on to immigration, which has long been a top priority for President Trump during both his terms in office. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, has been given $45 billion until September 30th, 2029 to detain undocumented immigrants, adults, and families, effectively bolstering the Immigration and Customs Enforcement's ability to operate. $32 billion will go directly towards immigration agents and operations related to enforcement and deportation, and approximately $11.25 billion will go towards their annual detention budget, specifically funding private prisons. On top of this, $75 billion will go towards further enforcement and surveillance of the southern border, which includes continued construction of Trump's signature border wall. $7 billion will go towards customs and border protection agents and vehicles, $5 billion for CBP facilities and checkpoints, $6.2 billion for border technology and surveillance, and a $10 billion fund for other border enforcement purposes. According to the American Immigration Council, immigration enforcement is also expected to expedite the removal process by shortcutting due process without court appearances, while allowing for state and local law to carry out federal immigration law enforcement. With this in mind, the Big Beautiful Bill explicitly allows for long-term or otherwise indefinite use of family detention centers for children and families. The National Immigration Law Center states that government officials, under 2 separate provisions, are now authorized to conduct physical examinations of children of any age without parents or legal guardians present, likely to search for gang-related tattoos or markings. Government officials have also been given measures to rapidly deport children back to the country from which they've fled, without either a day in court or any legal representation, defying existing due process protections. In addition to everything above, the Department of Justice has been given $3.3 billion to help prosecute immigrants for status offenses. which will likely ramp up the number of criminal prosecutions for immigrants. The Big Beautiful Bill has also introduced new and increased fees within the immigration process and immigration courts. The most notable is a new $5,000 border crossing penalty to those caught entering or leaving the US without proper authorization. Another update within the bill is that refugees, asylum seekers, those pending status approval, trafficking victims, and those with temporary protected statuses are no longer eligible for Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, Medicare, SNAP, and premium tax credits under the Affordable Care Act. However, states can choose to cover immigrants from their own funds, while emergency Medicaid is still available to anyone who needs it. We'll touch on health a bit later. Following the bill, ICE alone now has a larger budget than the Israeli military, which, as a reminder, can't seem to go 5 fucking minutes without throwing hands at one of its neighbors. Overall, the entire immigration enforcement budget within the United States across all agencies is between $150 to $170 billion over the next 5 years. Considering Russia's wartime economy military budget is estimated to be $160 billion this year, these figures demonstrate that the Trump administration is taking its immigration enforcement policy extremely seriously. We now move on to climate and the environment. As we previously covered before his second election win, it's always difficult to talk about President Trump's climate policies, because he doesn't really have any. The Big Beautiful Bill intends to roll back nearly $500 billion in green energy investment over the next 10 years. Much of this in the form of green energy tax credits introduced in Biden's 2021 infrastructure bill. Although there was a debate on how quickly such incentives should be rolled back, both House and Senate Republicans were in support of denying tax credits for companies that have supply chains with ties to a foreign entity of concern. This thinly veiled wording just means that they don't want to give away money to companies working with China. Despite concerns for Chinese dominance, many experts believe that this latest rollback in clean energy infrastructure may essentially cede the clean energy race to China. China made headlines earlier in May when it installed a whopping 93 gigawatts of solar and wind power in just 1 month. According to one analysis by the Asia Society Policy Institute, this equated to nearly 100 solar panels being installed every second. This means that just over the month of May, China's newly installed solar infrastructure could be enough to power the entire nation of Poland. In any case, it's hard to compete with that. The Big Beautiful Bill also rolls back restrictions for oil and gas drilling on federal land, and reduces associated royalties in an attempt to increase overall output. Mike Sommers, the president of the American Petroleum Institute, a lobbying group for the industry, would comment on the new laws, quote, "This bill will be the most transformational legislation we've seen in decades in terms of access to both federal lands and federal waters. It includes almost all of our priorities. President Trump has historically been quite apathetic towards renewable energy. In a June interview with Fox News, he would state in his own words, quote, "I don't want windmills destroying our place. I don't want these solar things where they go for miles and they cover up half a mountain that are ugly as hell." Aesthetics aside, cuts to renewables are planned to have a significant impact on the US economy. According to Energy Innovation, an energy and climate think tank, the bill's reduction of net energy to the grid will cost the average US household an extra $130 per year. The cost of that petrol might drop in the short term. However, the Center for American Progress estimates that these changes will increase petrol costs by 25 to 37 cents a gallon by the year 2035. It should be noted, however, that the Center for American Progress has been pretty clear about its anti-Trump stance. It's also estimated that 760,000 jobs will be lost by the year 2030. This was a conservative number comparative to other sources. Getting into some real tinfoil hat shit, the month of July would see the New York Times publish a story claiming that the Trump administration was planning to rescind the EPA's endangerment finding. The 2009 declaration scientifically established that greenhouse gases endanger human lives. This finding has since acted as the foundation for limiting pollution from things like vehicles, power plants, and factories. According to two insiders within the EPA, the agency intends to argue that placing climate regulations on automakers can pose harm to a person's health, as it leads to higher prices and reduced consumer choice. This hasn't been made public as of time of writing, and a betting man probably wouldn't put any serious stock in this leak. The reasoning itself sounds like a fucking Onion headline for a mustache-twirling supervillain, for fuck's sake. The whole concept of the agency in charge of protecting the environment enacting one of the most damning environmental policies of our time would be too monumentally stupid even by current standards. The rollback of renewable energy comes at a particularly striking time for the state of Texas this month, as a flash flood along the Guadalupe River would unfortunately take the lives of 135 people, including 27 children and counselors from Camp Mystic. 1.3 million Texan homes currently rest in areas which are prone to or at risk of dangerous levels of flooding. Although climate change may not have caused such a deadly disaster, its effects make such extreme weather events more frequent and intense. As David Faranda from the French National Center for Scientific Research would explain, quote, "Climate change loads the dice towards more frequent and more intense floods. The flash flood that tore through Camp Mystic at night, when people were most vulnerable, shows the deadly cost of underestimating this shift." The good news is that viewers in the coal, oil, or gas industries in the US are probably looking at moderate job security over the next 4 years. We now turn our attention to the biggest changes to the American welfare system since the passage of the Affordable Care Act. To start, Medicare has largely been unaffected in the new bill outside of a few provision changes, most notably denying eligibility to those in the country with lawful immigration status that have already been paid into the program, and revoking a Biden-era rule that established minimum staffing standards for nursing homes in the wake of the pandemic. The White House and numerous Republican lawmakers have emphasized that the bill does not touch Medicare and does not cut any aspect of the program. However, the Bipartisan Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, has estimated that roughly 1.4 million people will lose access to Medicare as a result of these changes, and would not be eligible to enroll in the public health plans available via the Affordable Care Act. A lesser covered part of this bill concerns changes to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as SNAP, or food stamps. SNAP currently helps provide basic levels of food to roughly 40 million people within the United States. The new bill mandates that all healthy adults work 80 hours a month for those between the ages of 19 to 64, an increase from the previous 19 to 54. It also introduces new requirements mandating that those with children above the age of 14 follow the work requirements, whereas previously those with dependents were exempt. The more significant portion, however, comes in the form of new rules around the federal government sharing the burden of funding the SNAP program with the states. Traditionally, the federal government picked up the full tab for the food benefits of SNAP. In the new bill, however, states are responsible for funding at least 5% of the food benefit. Notably, this rate increases depending on the state's error rate when paying beneficiaries. For example, a state with an error rate between 6 and 8% will owe 15% for the program, while any state above a 10% error rate will owe 25%. Supporters of the measure argue that these changes will increase accountability among the states that administer the program, stating that these steep penalties will weed out waste, fraud, and abuse. White House officials also point out that total dollars spent on programs aren't being cut, just that the federal government isn't on the hook for as much of the budget. This means that spending on the federal level will be lower. Critics of this new change state that error rates for such payments are currently at their lowest point in 50 years, and that these changes will likely eat away at other programs. Looking at Pennsylvania, for example, when the provisions go into effect in 2028, the state would roughly be on the hook for at least $212 million based on the minimum 5% funding rate. If we apply the 2024 error rate of 10.67%, however, we find that Pennsylvania would now be on the hook for $1.06 billion, or roughly 2.2% of the state's 2024 annual budget. As the federal government will be lowering its own costs to fund these initiatives, these add up to roughly $285 billion in cuts to SNAP and similar programs, or roughly 36% of its current budget. We now move on to the final safety net impacted by this bill: Medicaid. Unlike Medicare, which targets citizens over the age of 65, Medicaid is a program which allows lower-income citizens to afford healthcare. It's kind of like any healthcare system you'd see in any other first-world country, but just worse and more expensive. To start, lots of headlines are talking about a nearly $1 trillion or 15% cut to Medicaid funding from the federal government. This is in large part due to the bill changing how Medicaid provider taxes work, something that up until now only 40-year-old virgins or Jake the Analyst knew about. In the United States, states are afforded a great deal of leeway in how they raise the money used to help fund Medicaid. Roughly 68% of the funding comes from income and sales tax, and around 32% comes from provider taxes. The way it works is a state taxes things like hospitals, clinics, and nursing homes at a rate of up to 6% for services provided to everyone walking through the door. Using this money in combination with other forms of revenue, the state contributes to its Medicaid fund, and the federal government proportionally matches that money. From here, the state takes this final pot of money and pays out the providers for services rendered to specifically Medicaid patients. It honestly doesn't matter if you didn't understand any of that shit. All you need to know is that the 6% rate on provider taxes will be cut by 0.5% every year starting 2028 until 2031, leaving it at 3.5%. This is a big problem for mostly rural hospitals, most of which are surrounded by populations that are anywhere from 30 to 75% on Medicaid. Without the provider tax boosting funding for Medicaid, most rural hospitals will not be able to stay open, as they already operate within tight margins. To combat this, a $50 billion grant was also included in the bill to help support rural hospitals between 2026 and 2030, a time period where the cuts will largely not be in effect at their worst. Supporters of the measure point to the provider tax being a form of legalized money laundering that incentivizes hospitals to prioritize Medicaid beneficiaries, rather than serving the general population. They also argue that there's nothing in the bill itself cutting benefits or reducing eligibility, and that the tax was being used to pad the pockets of facilities that were already well off. Critics of the measure, including hospitals that pay taxes themselves, argue that reducing the amount of money Medicaid is allowed to generate ends up hurting local economies. They state that this will lead to growing blackout zones of emergency care availability and cause unnecessary deaths when hospitals inevitably close. The combined job losses from Medicaid and SNAP cuts are currently estimated to be between 730,000 to 1.22 million over the next 10 years. This would represent an approximate 0.8% increase in unemployment nationwide. Unfortunately, changes to a nation's health system can lead to huge knock-on effects for both the economy and the well-being of people who rely on such programs. It's estimated that this round of cuts will lead to $92 billion in lost economic activity, $2.6 billion in lost tax revenue, 7.6 million people left without insurance, 2 million people losing their primary care doctor, 1.3 million people being unable to refill their prescriptions, 380,000 women who won't be able to afford mammograms, and 17,000 people who will die each and every year these changes remain in effect. We also have it on very good authority that these death figure estimates are laughably low. Unfortunately, unlike a major war where casualties can be easily tracked, these preventable excess deaths will likely be entirely unnoticed. When it comes to health, boring budget cuts in long and uninteresting bills will always kill far more people than any war. Just earlier this year, a study from UCLA estimated that recent shuttering of US aid programs will lead to 14 million deaths by 2030 if the cuts remain in place. The Big Beautiful Bill also imposes work requirements on healthy members of Medicaid that are between the ages of 19 and 64 that do not have any children below the age of 14. The rule requires Medicaid members to perform a minimum of 80 hours either working, receiving some form of education or training, or performing qualifying activities like community service. In order to qualify for Medicaid, a single adult has to make less than $21,000 a year, or roughly $11 an hour in 40 states. In the other 10 states, that requirement is even lower. Supporters of the bill point out that it cuts unnecessary spending to provide tax cuts for everyday working families. Critics, meanwhile, point to studies from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy that found that the top 20% of income earners receive roughly 70% of the tax cuts in this bill. A study by the Yale Budget Lab found that these cuts to social safety nets will see households who make less than $14,000 a year see their annual incomes drop by $800 in 2027. Meanwhile, households earning over $128,000 per year stand to gain $9,700 on average, and the top 1% of households are set to gain an extra $63,000. It should be noted that although most Americans might not be losing health insurance, an increase to the uninsured population will still have knock-on effects to those who are able to keep their coverage. Uninsured people are much more likely to forego preventative health visits, and more likely to avoid medical treatment until confronted with an emergency. Not only can this lead to higher overall treatment costs, but it can also place increased burden on ER departments. It likely won't come as much of a surprise that US doctors have been overwhelmingly against the Big Beautiful Bill and its effects on America's health system. The only doctor we could find that was in favor of the bill was Dr. Phil. To sum up a 9-minute video he made, Dr. Phil praised the work requirements to use Medicaid, but he strangely never mentioned the health implications of the bill's other measures. The bottom line is, in terms of health and welfare changes, Americans in lower and middle tax brackets should expect a lower quality of these services, while those on the high-end income spectrum can expect a nice bump in disposable income. After going through everything within the Big Beautiful Bill, we worked with an economist to figure out what these changes mean for the United States as a whole. Despite some pretty drastic spending cuts, the Big Beautiful Bill is expected to increase the US deficit by $3 trillion over the next 10 years. This is because although the government will be saving $1.3 trillion in spending over this period, the reduction in taxes will see the government take in $3.7 trillion less over the same period. The White House projects that the bill will increase GDP by 3.5 percentage points, raise investment by 7.5 percentage points, and raise wages by up to $11,600. Other economists generally disagree. Averaging up analyses from the Independent Tax Foundation and the Penn-Wharton economic model shows that GDP would only increase by around 0.75 percentage points over 30 years. Furthermore, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the bill would increase GDP by only an average of 0.5 percentage points over the next decade. It's probably not a surprise that figures from within the White House tend to inflate the benefits of the bill. It's literally their job to hype up the president. Just by visiting the official White House Twitter page, you'd pretty quickly realize that it's not exactly impartial. Favorite recent tweets include a Hulk Hogan shitpost praising the president's health initiative hours after the wrestler died, an AI picture of the president depicted as a Sith Lord, and a photo of Trump as the main character of an aggressively pro-immigration movie. So why are independent figures so different from the White House's estimates? According to our economist, that all comes down to modeling. Firstly, the White House assumes that the bill's various temporary tax deductions will last forever. This assumption counts for around 0.7 percentage points of the 3.5 percentage points the White House is touting. Another very strange assumption is that the model assumes provisions that are not actually in the bill. One such provision is the assumption that there will be a lower tax rate on manufacturing income, even though there is nothing about this in the bill. Finally, and probably most importantly, the White House does not account for the fact that the increase in the budget deficit will increase borrowing costs for the average person. This is because the government borrows money from the public by selling treasury bonds. Buying bonds is basically a bet that the US government will still be around in the future, and that the dollar won't lose too much value to inflation by the time you get paid back. Historically, these have provided very low but stable guarantees as a return on investment. However, this is because the public has always believed that the US government will definitely be able to pay them back at the end of the bond expiry date. If the public believes that the government is less likely to pay them back because their credit rating was recently downgraded, for example, they will ask for higher and higher interest rates. This increased budget deficit, alongside tariff threats and general economic headwinds, is starting to make the public skeptical in its ability to provide a real return on these bonds. This has knock-on effects on interest rates in general, as long-term treasury bonds are essentially the floor for long-term interest rates. Financial institutions won't let people borrow money if the interest rate is less than the treasury bonds. If that was the case, they wouldn't bother fucking around with lending money to the public, when they can just buy government bonds and call it a day. With a larger deficit causing higher interest rates, this in turn leads to people spending a larger portion of their income on mortgage repayments, rather than ways that are economically productive. This depresses spending on things that move the economy, and may have broader knock-on effects for the cost of living and GDP. Of course, no one can predict the future, least of all economists. But just because a person is paying less in taxes doesn't mean they're necessarily keeping more of their hard-earned eddies. The bill itself passed almost entirely on party lines, with all Democrats voting against the bill, and all by 2 Republicans voting in favor. In response to questions about the deficit, the White House argues that the government will be making back most of the lost revenue through tariffs and additional growth. However, our economist believes this statement to be extremely optimistic. At best, the Tax Foundation estimates that the US will generate $2.5 trillion from tariffs over 10 years, not accounting for the costs of revenues from lower GDP and less jobs resulting from tariffs. The US government is currently $36 trillion in debt, and viewers shouldn't expect that number to go down anytime soon. A consumer movement by the name of Stop Killing Games has picked up some serious traction over the last few months, and finds itself on the verge of debate within the European Commission. The initiative was first launched in April by Ross Scott, following servers of the Ubisoft-published The Crew being shut down indefinitely. Although The Crew is mostly a single-player game, its always-online nature necessitated a constant internet connection to play. The removal of the servers essentially revokes access to the game for all players who bought it. Ross Scott argues that this practice is not only an assault on consumer rights, but also the principles of media preservation. Scott compares the gaming landscape today to that of the silent film era, in which poor preservation practices led to most films of that generation being completely lost to time. It's estimated that around 75% of all American-made silent feature films between 1912 and 1929 are now considered completely lost, and along with it, their rich cultural value. Several petitions within France and the UK would fail to attract parliamentary support despite gaining significant traction. In May of this year, Scott would go on to publish a spreadsheet containing various online-only video games along with their playability status. The spreadsheet showed that out of the 731 games shown, 68% were either unplayable or at risk. 110 were being preserved by fans, and just 16 were deemed playable after being discontinued. Fast forward to this month, and the movement would attract a response from Video Games Europe, a trade association representing game developers and publishers in the EU. Their statement would read, quote, "We appreciate the passion of our community. However, the decision to discontinue online services is multifaceted, never taken lightly, and must be an option for companies when an online experience is no longer commercially viable. We understand that it can be disappointing for players, but when it does happen, the industry ensures that players are given fair notice of the prospective changes in compliance with local consumer protection laws." The association would argue that solutions such as private servers cannot always act as a viable alternative to ones run by a developer. They state that private servers could make player data more vulnerable and leave publishers legally viable for unsafe player-made content. They also argue that implementing these regulations could make games prohibitively expensive to develop and stifle creativity within the industry. On the other side, advocates argue that if a publisher is able to revoke a game's playability at a later date, then it stands to reason that storefronts should at least have to notify consumers that they're not actually buying a game, but rather a temporary license to play it.
You there, sir? I certainly hope you've got a license to play video games.
A law in California, which came into effect in January, now makes it illegal for digital storefronts to use the terms buy and purchase if it's only providing a digital license. Meanwhile, Steam now labels game purchases that only include a license to play. In the middle of July, one of the European Parliament's vice presidents, Nikolai Stefanuta, would voice his support for a newly minted EU Citizens Initiative. This new petition has now gathered over 1 million signatures and is currently considered up for official debate by the European Commission. The EU has basically become the regulation capital of the world in terms of consumer protections, especially when it comes to technology. This means that even if other regions don't get on board, passing such regulations affecting game preservation would essentially force developers to comply, or be shut out of a huge segment of their consumer base. Assuming drastic legislation is passed, we may one day be able to return to being the dedicated dirty bomb channel we were always destined to become. The British government has unveiled plans to allow citizens as young as 16 to vote, in what is the nation's biggest round of electoral reform in half a century. The plan would give an additional 1.8 million citizens the right to vote by the nation's next general election in 2029. 16-year-olds can already vote for members of parliament and local representatives in Scotland and Wales, but this new reform would also extend these rights to England and Northern Ireland. The current Labour government hopes that lowering the age requirement for voters will increase voter participation, which reached a 20-year low in last year's general election, failing to break 60%. It's also hoped that a lower age requirement will make young people more satisfied with democracy and democratic institutions as a whole. Scotland, Argentina, and Austria already have this same lowered age requirement, and it's been well documented that a lowered threshold paired with a focus on civics education can increase democratic participation in the long term. Critics of the reform, such as Conservative Shadow Minister Paul Holmes, argue that the change is inconsistent with other similar rights. In his own words, quote, "Why does this government think that a 16-year-old can vote but not be allowed to buy a lottery ticket, an alcoholic drink, marry, or go to war, or even stand in the elections they're voting in?" As Prime Minister Keir Starmer would point out, however, this line of thinking also cuts both ways. Quote, "They're old enough to go out to work, they're old enough to pay taxes, and I think if you pay in, you should have the opportunity to say what you want your money spent on, which way the government should go." Of course, a big question at the moment is, what does any of this mean for the next election? Depending on the constituency, the 2-year expanded age window only accounts for 1.5 to 4.5% of the entire voter base. Although 16 to 17-year-olds actually tend to vote at a higher rate than 18 to 20-year-olds, their voting preferences don't seem to vary all that much. There's an argument to be made that the current Labour government is set to benefit the most from such reform, but the stats are a little more nuanced. Looking at the results from last election, we can see that lower age brackets were far less likely to vote for the Conservative Party, but were also notably less supportive of Labour than the middle-age groups. The 18 to 29 range was notably more supportive of Reform UK than the well-entrenched Conservative Party. Reform UK, a right-wing populist party, notably punched far above its weight in the previous election, and is currently sitting at the top of opinion polls by a healthy margin. Along with the age reduction, voters can now use a bank card as a form of ID on election day. Supporters of this change argue that strict identification can deter eligible citizens from exercising their right to vote. An estimated 4% of non-voters in the last election stated that they didn't vote due to ID rules, which the Electoral Commission says mostly affected private renters and young people. In 2022, the Conservative Party introduced a photo ID requirement when voting, a measure they argued would combat fraud. This new law would quite famously go on to affect former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was turned away from his local polling station after forgetting his own photo ID. Mad props to the election worker who got to say,
"Sorry, Mr. Prime Minister, I don't make the rules. I'm just following the fucking idiots who made them."
A much more popular feature within this new round of voting reform are rules which require political donations to come from companies that actually operate within the UK. It's currently possible for foreign individuals to make political donations as high as $100 million when doing so through a UK-based company. These reforms are likely designed to stop the likes of Russia from trying to swing results to their own ends. British intelligence stated that Russian influence within the UK is commonplace, and found substantial evidence of Russia attempting to interfere in Scotland's 2014 independent referendum. Much like the CIA, interfering in foreign democracies has become a proud pastime of the Russian government, as the nation has previously meddled with elections in Bulgaria, France, Georgia, Italy, Latvia, Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, Spain, Transylvania, Turkey, Ukraine, and America. The previous UK election was only last July, so we'll have to wait another 4 years before we see the effects of these sweeping changes. British politicians should be extra concerned with the needs of current 12-year-olds, because by the time the next election rolls around, those kids might just vote them out of office. We now move on to Ukraine, which is quickly approaching the 3.5-year mark of open war. The month of July saw very little ground lost or gained by either side in the conflict, with no significant strategic positions being traded. In the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk, Russia is attempting to cut roads and encircle the town. This may become a problem within the next few months if Ukraine is unable to halt the envelopment or launch a counterattack of its own. As regular viewers are probably aware, the invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated the newly evolved drone meta for warfare. Drones have proven to be incredibly cheap, have the ability to counter difficult to replace assets such as tanks and other armored vehicles, and are able to overwhelm infantry in swarm-style tactics. With this in mind, the drone meta has shifted in all kinds of unpredictable ways along the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. In the early days of the war, Ukraine relied heavily on the German Gepard, an anti-aircraft gun that proved heavily effective at shooting down Russia's Iranian-made Shahed drones. However, Switzerland would block ammo shipments to Ukraine due to its strict neutrality laws, which would later lead to Germany setting up its own domestic production. The Gepards were exceptionally effective. However, their limited numbers would lead Ukraine to start mounting them on trucks, turning them into less predictable anti-air teams. Russia would eventually adapt by flying higher to stay out of their relatively short 4-kilometer range, as well as sending decoy drones to burn through Ukraine's limited ammo. A decked-out country like the United States could just intercept these drones with missiles, but to say this would be more than expensive would be a severe understatement. Buying an exported Patriot missile battery can cost as much as $2.5 billion, and even then you're paying up to $4 million for every missile. Considering Iran's Shahed drones cost around $200,000 on the high end, Ukraine can't exactly afford to always use missiles straight off of Raytheon's assembly lines. A much cheaper alternative employed by Ukraine was to use electronic warfare systems to simply jam drones mid-air, disabling their GPS systems to keep them off target. This worked pretty well for cheaper drones, but wasn't so effective for drones with optical terminal guidance. If a drone has the ability to visually recognize where it is, scrambling its GPS systems isn't going to slow it down. By 2023, Ukraine would officially launch its Clear Sky project. The idea was to deploy huge numbers of cheap, interceptor drones. These would be equipped with first-person cameras and aim to ram or explode onto enemy drones mid-air. The goal was not only to teach large numbers of operators how to effectively pilot drones, but to ramp up domestic manufacturing to make drone defense more cost-effective. Fast forward to today, and the drone meta has become even more sophisticated. Russia began employing jammer drones, which although didn't carry a payload, could disrupt Ukraine's interceptors and blind their operators. Ukraine would counter once again by making optical guided interceptor drones, which could lock onto targets and counter these jamming attempts. The latest innovations in this terrifying era of warfare have been drones launched via rocket boosters or balloons. This is done to conserve battery life in order to extend their effective range. So basically, we're at a point where Ukraine is employing drones that are designed to take out Russia's anti-drone drones, which were only made because Ukraine was using drones to take out Russia's drones. This all comes after last month's NATO summit, in which members committed to spending 5% of their GDP on defense. It should be noted that this 5% target also includes military aid sent to Ukraine, which is really fucking good for Ukraine, and even better for the United States, which will be selling the lion's share of weapons. This month, US President Trump would also announce that if a peace deal is not struck between Russia and Ukraine within 50 days, he would impose a 100% tariff on all nations that buy oil from Russia. Whether this will actually happen is anyone's guess. Trump's campaign promise of ending the Ukraine war on day one of his presidency sure as shit didn't happen. With this said, we know that Putin has been willing to kill an entire generation of his own people to prolong this useless war. And we also know that Trump can't go 5 fucking minutes without trying to tariff something. If Trump actually goes through with this promise, it could be the single most damaging thing to happen to Russia since the start of his presidency. The announcement comes just days before the EU's 18th sanctions resolution, which further cripples Russia's oil industry. These sanctions lower the oil price cap to be 15% below the market average, bans transactions with Nord Stream 1 and 2, and bans refined products made from Russian crude oil. This means that even if processed outside of Russia, these products can never enter the EU. The sanctions also target Russia's supply of military assets from third-party countries, further restricts Russian financial institutions, and attempts to throttle the circumvention of previously imposed restrictions. To wrap up our Ukraine coverage, the 22nd of July saw Zelensky pass a bill curtailing the powers and independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO. In a rare case of internal division, thousands of Ukrainian citizens took to the streets in protest, in what would become the biggest wave of protests since the war began. Demonstrators believe this change would allow members of Zelensky's government to quash corruption investigations against themselves. The measure was initially signed into law in an attempt to weed out potential Russian infiltration of anti-corruption bodies. However, the downside is a pretty significant hit to Ukraine's democratic standing. This was particularly alarming to Ukraine's European allies, as democratic backsliding could spell an end to Ukraine's ambitions to eventually eventually join the European Union. The invasion has already seen a significant level of domestic erosion within the country. Most notably, Ukraine has had to postpone its general election, which was supposed to take place in early 2024. Unfortunately, a combination of mass displacement, huge Russian influence campaigns, and the fact that Russia currently occupies 18% of the country simply makes the process of holding fair elections entirely unfeasible. That's not even considering Russia's well-documented history of targeting civilian infrastructure, which makes voting centers very desirable targets. Only 2 days after the aforementioned law was passed, Volodymyr Zelensky publicly expressed his regret in passing the bill. In this same address, Zelensky also announced that a new draft of legislation has been submitted to Parliament and is to be voted on the 31st of July. In Zelensky's own words, quote, "It is very important that society speaks. I respect the opinion of society." Wow guys, we really do live in a society. Why the bill was so hastily pushed into law is still currently unclear. This may have just been a misstep where democracy is blindly sidestepped in the pursuit of the greater good. Overall, the stated goal of this bill was to ultimately keep democratic institutions intact and free of outside influence. A much less likely opinion is that this was a pure and simple power grab, but this seems highly unlikely. Ukraine's status as a democracy is vital for the continued support of its allies, and Zelensky looks like he's been running on 3 hours of sleep for the past 3 years. Another option is that this was all part of some 5D chess move, as it would show who would vote in favor of curtailing the powers of the NABU and SAPO. The most likely reason, however, is that the government simply jumped the gun and misjudged how the bill would be perceived to the general public. Ukraine has long had serious problems with corruption, and in the midst of fighting a war for its survival, such corruption can be incredibly damaging for both its own credibility and ability to effectively defend itself. Hopefully one day we'll know the full context behind this bill and its very short-lived lifespan. The news is over, but our behind-the-scenes production never stops. We're always working on around 5 to 6 projects at once that all seem to take an entire presidential administration to finish. But while they're getting made, why not check out our second channel, Sir Swag Academy?
Gus called his coworkers needy bitches, missed a sponsored recording session, and explained that he was out drinking too late with the boys. That was the text. That was the text that was sent to
work for you, but you all work for me.
We'd also like to thank our incredible Patreon supporters for making this entire series possible. The news takes roughly 10 people 2 whole weeks to put together, and YouTube sure as hell isn't recommending us to anyone new with the kinds of topics we cover. We're basically doing the opposite of algorithm baiting, so it's a miracle you guys keep showing up. If you'd like to help us out and get your name in the end credits, a link to support us will be down below. Until next time, on behalf of the entire team, we'd like to wish everyone a very happy August.
Let's face the facts about me and you, a love unspecified. Though I'm proud to call you Chocolate Bear, the crowd will always talk and stare.
I feel exactly those feelings too, and that's why I keep them inside. 'Cause this bear can't bear the world's disdain, and sometimes it's easier to hide
Then explain our guy love, that's all it is. Guy love, he's mine, I'm his. There's nothing gay about it in our eyes.
You ask me about this thing we share,
And he tenderly replies,
it's guy love.
between two guys.